Welcome to Once Upon a Crime. This month we're highlighting love, true crime style. In this series, I'll share stories of women who fell in love with serial killers and married them. Theodore Robert Bundy was one of the United States' most prolific serial killers. He was suspected of abducting, raping, and killing more than 30 women in at least 6 states. During his murder spree, he conducted a long-term relationship with a single mother and began another after he was arrested for an attempted kidnapping. While his first romantic partner had no knowledge of Bundy's nefarious activities and cooperated with the police during their investigation, the second, Carole Boone, who'd become his wife, began a romantic relationship with the suspected serial killer after he was accused of kidnappings and murders. What causes a person to fall in love with a serial killer? We are attempting to answer that question in this month's series. This is Chapter 2 of So I Married a Serial Killer, Mrs. Ted Bundy, Carole Boone. In the last episode, I shared the story of a woman who fell in love with serial killer Richard Ramirez. Doreen Leoy lived a life rich in fantasy in which Ramirez was not a monster who violently attacked women young and old, but a hurt little boy. Doreen convinced herself that her unconditional love would save Ramirez, whom she considered her perfect mate, and they'd live happily ever after. Carole Ann Boone was the polar opposite of Doreen Leoy. She was solid, responsible, competent, and capable, a salt-of-the-earth type of person. However, she was also highly idealistic, and when she took up a cause, she committed herself to it 100%. Investigative journalist and author Stephen Michaud spent countless hours with Carole Boone and Ted Bundy. His book, The Only Living Witness, is one of the most detailed accounts of the infamous serial killer's life and crimes. Michaud characterizes Carole as, quote, an interesting person. She was idealistic in a way I'd like to see more of in this cynical day and age, he wrote, but she left herself open to be manipulated. One factor psychologists find common to those who enter into romantic relationships with violent felons is a savior complex, or possessing a belief that they can save or transform the criminal. In Carole's case, after Bundy was found guilty and sentenced to death, she helped with his appeals in a literal attempt to save his life. A story from early in Carole's life may help explain why she felt so compelled to save Bundy. Carole Ann Carson was born in Seattle, Washington on April 2, 1947. She was the family's middle child and only daughter. In the summer of 1960, Carole was tasked with watching her brother while he was swimming laps in the pool. The boy became fatigued and slipped under the water. By the time Carole noticed, her brother had drowned. Carole felt guilty about this all of her life, which may have contributed to her need to commit to people or causes with such dogged determination and never ceased trying to help those that needed her. Carole attended Lincoln High School in Seattle, Washington, and earned good grades. However, she dropped out in 1964 at 17 when she became pregnant. She was dating James Boone, a football player, and her first high school boyfriend. He was even younger than Carole, just 16 when he became a father. The teens eloped to Idaho, where they were allowed to marry legally as minors. Their son, James Boone Jr., was born 5 months later. The Boones moved to Yakima, Washington, where James worked as a laborer. Carole and James's marriage lasted only a few years. They remained amicable, co-parenting their son they called Jamie, with little conflict. Carole would keep Boone as her last name. Carole entered into a second marriage in 1973. The union with her new husband was already strained when she met Ted Bundy in May 1974. Theodore Robert Bundy was 28 when he met Carole Boone while working as a summer intern at the Department of Emergency Services in Olympia, Washington. Bundy was beefing up his resume for law school applications. He worked with Carole as part of a team organizing searches for several young women who had gone missing in the area over the last 4 months. All of them would later be determined to be victims of Ted Bundy. Bundy's first confirmed victim was Karen Sparks, a University of Washington student who was viciously attacked on January 4, 1974, while sleeping in her basement apartment bedroom. She survived, but suffered permanent brain damage. Less than a month later, on February 1st, Linda Ann Healy disappeared from the University of Washington campus. Her remains would be found in the Taylor Mountains, outside of Seattle, a year later. Bundy continued his murder spree, killing at least one woman every month for the next 4 months. On March 12th, Evergreen State College student Donna Gail Manson disappeared. On April 17th, Susan Rancourt vanished while walking to her Central Washington State College campus dorm. On May 6th, Roberta Parks disappeared from Oregon State University in Corvallis. On June 1st, Brenda Ball went missing after visiting a pub near the Seattle-Tacoma airport. Georgianne Hawkins vanished from the University of Washington campus 10 days later. Carole recalled meeting Bundy that spring, as her marriage was falling apart. Bundy had just ended a 5-year relationship with another single mother, Elizabeth Klopfer, also known as Liz Kendall. Carole thought Ted was good-looking, intelligent, and kind. He'd been active in Republican politics and seemed more, quote, serious and straight-laced than the others in the office. Most of her co-workers were younger people passionate about activism and volunteering. Carole was described as a mother figure in the office. She was efficient, yet caring. Carole easily navigated between being the calm and measured role model for her younger coworkers and joining in during more lighthearted and playful activities. She and Bundy, who were closer in age, soon became friends. She recalled, quote, "We hit it off well. He struck me as a rather shy person with a lot more going on than what was on the surface. He was certainly more dignified and restrained than the others around the office," end quote. That summer, Bundy invited Carole to his home in Tacoma, where he prepared dinner. There was a mild attraction between the two, and Carole said Ted was interested in dating her, but she was already seeing another man, and he had yet to fully sever ties with his girlfriend Liz. Ted and Carole remained friends. It was also that summer that Ted Bundy murdered 2 women on the same day. On July 14th, Bundy lured Janice Ott from the beach at Lake Sammamish by asking her to help with his boat. The man who approached her had his arm in a sling and a friendly smile. He seemed harmless, but was far from it. Bundy incapacitated Janice and drove her away in his tan Volkswagen Beetle. After killing the woman, he returned to the lake. 4 hours later, he repeated this with another young woman, Denise Nosland. By now, there had been at least 3 Ted sightings at locations where women had gone missing. In each, witnesses described seeing a white male approximately in his mid-20s with shaggy brown hair and his arm in a sling. In some of these reports, he'd approached other women who declined to help him and thus escaped with their lives. These women reported that the stranger had introduced himself as Ted. He was sometimes said to be driving a tan Volkswagen Beetle. Bundy must have realized that investigators were closing in on him because just a few weeks after the Lake Sammamish murders, he relocated to Salt Lake City, Utah. He would begin classes at the University of Utah Law School that fall. He and Carole remained in touch through letters. Bundy murdered 4 more women, 1 in Idaho while he was traveling to Utah, and 3 more when he reached the state. On November 8th, Bundy attempted to kidnap 18-year-old Carole DeRanche from a Murray, Utah shopping mall. Posing as an undercover officer, he lured her into his vehicle in the mall parking lot and handcuffed her. She was able to escape the car and run to safety. DeRanche gave a detailed description of Officer Ted. He'd also left behind a crucial piece of evidence. The handcuffs were still dangling from DeRanche's wrists. Bundy's bloodlust had not yet been satisfied when his intended victim managed to escape. Later that evening, he abducted 17-year-old Deborah Kent from a school parking lot a few miles away. The key matching the handcuffs used to restrain DeRanche were found lying in the parking lot. Witnesses reported a man who asked at least 2 people to come outside to identify a car, but they declined. Bundy was also seen pacing behind the school auditorium shortly before Deborah Kent went missing. His description was widely distributed and made its way back to Washington State, where the elusive Ted was still being sought in several disappearances. Detectives narrowed down their suspects based on the description of Ted and his vehicle. Theodore Robert Bundy was still on their radar. In November, soon after Carole DaRonch's attempted abduction and Debbie Kent's disappearance, Bundy's former girlfriend, Liz, contacted police. She told them about the similarities between her Ted and the man they sought. His physical description matched, as did his car, a tan VW. After the Ted sighting at Lake Sammamish, she became aware of the similarities and even joked about it with him. But she became more alarmed when she learned women were disappearing in Utah, where she told them Bundy had just relocated. Investigators added Liz's report to their file. She was not the first person to suspect a friend, partner, or family member of being the wanted man. They had filed hundreds of such reports since their investigation began. In 1975, Bundy traveled further east to Colorado to select his next victims. Karen Campbell disappeared from Snowmass, Colorado on January 12th, Julie Cunningham from Vail, Colorado on March 15th, and April 16th was the last time Denise Oliverson was seen in Grand Junction. Bundy was dating two women he'd met in law school in the spring of 1975. He was also periodically returning to Washington to visit Liz and even considered marrying her. He invited Carole Boone and two other former coworkers to visit him in Salt Lake City in May. He offered to take them skiing and sightseeing. They stayed at Ted's apartment for a week. Soon after she visited Salt Lake, Carole's divorce was finalized, and she moved to California to work with an organization that ran a humanitarian camp for Vietnamese refugees. On August 15th, Bundy was pulled over in Granger, Utah, while driving his tan VW. It was the early morning hours, and the patrol officer suspected him of casing the neighborhood for houses to burglarize. When the officer deployed his lights and siren, Bundy attempted to flee. He was soon caught, and his vehicle was searched. Inside, the officer found large garbage bags, an ice pick, a flashlight, gloves, and a mask made from pantyhose with eye holes cut into them. He was arrested on suspicion of owning burglary tools and evading a police officer. Bundy could not be held long on the evasion charge alone, so he was soon released. A week later, a warrant to search his apartment was issued. Utah police contacted investigators in Washington and compared notes. Liz was brought in for another interview. The information she provided, including timelines of Bundy's travels, brought him to the top of their suspect list. He was brought in for a lineup, and Carole DaRonch picked him out as the man who'd attempted to kidnap her. Bundy was arrested and now investigated for a series of disappearances in Washington, Colorado, and Utah. Shortly after his arrest, Carole Boone learned that Ted was suspected of multiple murders and disappearances of young women. A friend called to inform her of the news. Carole recalled, quote, "Things just kind of went blank. I remember sitting there after we hung up. I don't remember driving home from work that night. I sat until dawn in my living room with my Vietnamese roommates bringing me cups of tea and lots of cigarettes. I drank a lot of scotch. I was feeling the same sort of shock you feel when somebody close to you has died." End quote. Carole was contacted by investigators and gave Ted a glowing review. She said he'd been a very good friend to her who'd helped her through a rough divorce and the death of her uncle. She couldn't believe such a thoughtful, kind man could be a killer. Bundy went on trial in Utah for the attempted kidnapping and was found guilty on March 1st, 1976. He received a sentence of 1 to 15 years behind bars. After he began serving his sentence at the Utah State Prison, he and Carole continued to write to each other. Their letters became more intimate, and the romantic relationship began in earnest. Carole wrote in one of her early letters to Bundy, quote, "I've come to such a caring and commitment to you. I want to be there if I can help. It's hard for me to explain, but I need you. The affection that I get, and that which I feel, such affection, such caring, is a blessed, treasurable thing. Dearest Bunny," she wrote, calling him by the pet name she'd given him, "I know you are innocent, and I know there's a way for you to be free." 2 months after he was sentenced, Carole traveled to Utah State Prison to visit Bundy. Their relationship deepened, with him coming to depend on Carole's support in both practical and emotional ways. She believed in his innocence completely and vowed to help Bundy clear his name and regain his freedom. In the meantime, she wrote him letters, sent care packages, and paid for the collect calls Bundy placed to her from prison. By October of that year, Bundy was charged with the first-degree murder of Karen Campbell, who'd gone missing in Colorado. Her body was found in a snowbank a month later. Bundy had been linked to Karen's murder by hair collected in his vehicle that matched hers, credit card receipts that proved he was in the area on that day, and eyewitnesses who reported seeing a man matching Bundy's description on the day in question. By this time, Carole was completely convinced that Ted was innocent of the terrible things he was accused of. Even as the allegations continued to mount and the evidence stacked against him, Carole pledged her unwavering support. She became the person closest to him, lending him a sympathetic ear, doing whatever she could to help his attorneys with his appeal, and being a go-between with his family and friends. Bundy was extradited to Aspen, Colorado, to stand trial for the murder of Karen Campbell in the spring of 1977. Carole and Ted exchanged frequent letters and phone calls and professed deep romantic feelings for each other. He called Carole my beloved Boone, and she called him Bunny. Bundy acted as his own attorney and was allowed to use the county courthouse law library. On June 7, 1977, he jumped out of a second-floor window and escaped. He injured his ankle in the 30-foot jump, but managed to limp his way into the woods and hide out for 6 days. He was captured on June 13th in a stolen car, hungry, bedraggled, and sleep-deprived. 7 months later, Bundy escaped for a second time. After weeks of planning, he slipped out of the Garfield County Jail through the ductwork and disappeared. Investigators suspected that Carole may have aided Bundy in some way, but she never admitted any knowledge of his plan. But a letter the fugitive left behind in his cell from Carole suggested she may have known and tried to persuade him to abandon the plan. She wrote, quote, "I understand the solutions you see to your problems, especially your preferred one. But I keep feeling so very strongly that there is something else, another way." She then expresses her belief that his conviction was unjust, but seems to be saying that if he chooses to escape, they have no chance at a normal life together. She writes that she believes he will be exonerated and then says, quote, "Barring your solution, you and I will be able to go out and have a beer like normal people. Love, I am so positive that even though I have no idea of when or where or how, I am looking forward to it." End quote. But Bunny had other plans. He slipped away on that cold December night and would not be seen again for almost 6 weeks. By then, he'd left another path of destruction in his wake. On January 14, 1978, Ted Bundy entered the Chi Omega sorority house on the Florida State University campus in Tallahassee, Florida, and brutally attacked 4 sleeping women. He bludgeoned and strangled Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy to death, and severely injured Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler. Afterward, he traveled 8 blocks away and broke into the basement apartment of FSU student Cheryl Thomas and attacked her as well. She suffered 5 skull fractures and a broken jaw, but survived. On February 9th, Bundy kidnapped 12-year-old Kimberly Leach from a junior high school parking lot in Lake City, Florida. Her body was found 2 months later under a pig shed. She had been raped and mutilated. Less than a week later, a patrol officer in West Pensacola noticed a suspicious vehicle driving with its headlights off at 1 a.m. and called in the license plate number. The Volkswagen Beetle came back as stolen. When the officer attempted to arrest the driver, he fought with him and tried to flee. He was tackled by the officer and taken into custody. He refused to give his identity, but his fingerprints identified him as Theodore Robert Bundy, a fugitive from Colorado, wanted for kidnapping and murder. What Carole thought about Bundy's escape, or what she did while he was a fugitive, is unknown. What we do know is that Carole was not the first person Bundy called after his arrest in Florida. That call was made to his ex-girlfriend, Liz Kendall. Carole wasn't his second or even his third phone call. He called his mother, a friend, and a Seattle attorney, John Henry Brown, first. Carole was his 5th phone call. Still, she was soon in constant contact with Bundy again through phone calls and letters, writing one in March, filled with longing and sadness for him. Quote, "Oh, dearest Theodore, your letter is so sad and alone. Nice to know you care, you love and need me. I wish it weren't so hard for you." End quote. Bundy's story became national news. Carole Boone was soon linked to the suspected serial killer and referred to as Bundy's girlfriend. Bundy was indicted on first-degree murder, attempted first-degree murder, and burglary in the Chi Omega sorority attack. By the time his trial began the following summer, Carole had uprooted her life to be near him. She quit her job in Washington state and moved to Florida, living in cheap motels. She spent up to 16 hours a day assisting his attorneys in preparing for trial. Richard Bundy, Ted Bundy's younger half-brother, recalled, quote, "Carole basically became his legal secretary. I could tell that she had clerical abilities. She would keep the files organized." End quote. An Orlando Sentinel reporter interviewed Carole during the Chi Omega trial in 1979. She blamed Bundy's ex-girlfriend, Liz Kendall, for his troubles. Kendall was a, quote, "bitter and angry ex-girlfriend who phoned authorities in Washington state, establishing a tenuous thread between Ted and the murder of 2 women abducted at Lake Sammamish in 1974. The rest is history." End quote. Carole also said she'd never, quote, "hang around with the man who goes around killing my own kind. I'm a feminist." Carole would be a constant presence in the courtroom. "She was in the courtroom, I think, pretty much every day," author Steve Wynn said. "She was not expressive, except for this weird smile that she had. She was just a little strange, and no matter what happened, no matter what the day's testimony was, she would always have an explanation for why it was wrong or not incriminating." End quote. Ted Bundy famously botched his murder trial because of his narcissism and refusal to take the advice of his attorneys. He insisted on acting as his own attorney, perhaps craving the spotlight. His trial was one of the first to be televised nationally in the U.S. One of Bundy's attorneys, Polly Nelson, would later write, quote, "He sabotaged the entire defense out of spite, distrust, and grandiose delusion. Ted was facing murder charges with a possible death sentence, and all that mattered to him, apparently, was that he be in charge." End quote. On July 24, 1979, after the jury deliberated for just 7 hours, Bundy was convicted on all charges and sentenced to death in Florida's electric chair. Bundy faced a second trial for the murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. His defense attorneys advised him to take a guilty plea. They and Carole were still attempting to save his life, but Ted would have none of it. He refused to plead, unwilling to state in open court that he was guilty of murder. Carole told journalist Stephen Michaud, quote, "Ted would accept spending the rest of his life behind bars, as long as he didn't have to say he did it." End quote. Bundy's second murder trial began in January 1980. Carole and her 13-year-old son, Jamie, had lived hand-to-mouth since she moved to Florida to be near Ted. Michaud spent hours with Carole and Ted preparing to write a book about the case. Carole had been by Ted's side in Florida for about a year when she began pressing him to marry her. She was already wearing a gold signet ring with the letter T engraved in it. Before the Leach trial began, she and Ted wrote letters to the jail chaplain, requesting authorization for a wedding ceremony. Focusing on what value Carole added to his life, Bundy wrote, quote, "I find her devotion to me awesome, and her love for me is soothing and inspiring." Carole wrote about the role model Ted was to her son, quote, "Ted is a major figure in my son's life. He takes a great deal of interest in Jamie and provides him with guidance and advice that a boy needs." End quote. When reporters inquired why she'd want to marry a convicted death row prisoner, Carole said, "It's a very private thing, and I don't care what people external to our lives think." Their marriage request was denied by the judge as, quote, "not in the inmate's best interest." Michaud recalls that Bundy was relieved upon learning of the denial. Quote, "I can testify as a direct witness that Ted didn't want anything more to do with it," he later stated. Carole essentially blackmailed him into marriage. Michaud claimed Carole had threatened to leave Florida and move back to Seattle if Bundy did not agree to formalize their relationship. Quote, "Carole kept pushing, doing all she could, so that she and Ted could be together as a family, have children, just like other people. It sounds a little weird, but that's what she kept pushing, that they were going to be a family. Amid all this horror, she was fighting to put together some kind of family." End quote. Carole was Bundy's only connection to the world outside of his prison walls beyond his attorneys, and he needed her. He agreed to marry her, and they devised a plan. In the meantime, already faced with an impending death sentence and feeling under pressure to please Carole, Bundy began to unravel mentally. He was also playing to the cameras, knowing that the other death row inmates were watching his performance on television. He'd either be congratulated or derided when he returned to the prison each evening. Bundy always had an overwhelming need to feel like the smartest guy in the room. This resulted in his overbearing courtroom behavior and rubbed the jury the wrong way. Noticing this dynamic, and knowing it could sabotage him with the jury, Carole decided to step in. Bundy had long been a heavy drinker, and Carole now smuggled alcohol into the courtroom in juice containers. She also brought him lunch bags filled with snacks. The investigator for Bundy's defense, Don Kennedy, later reported finding prescription tranquilizers in a bag of goodies that Carole had brought to court. Stephen Michaud confirms this, saying, quote, "Every day Carole was sending in Valium and vodka, so by the afternoon, he was just smashed in the courtroom," end quote. On February 7, 1980, Bundy was convicted of the murder of Kimberly Leach. On February 9th, Bundy put Carole on the stand as a character witness for the penalty portion of the trial. She asked the jury for mercy, urging them to fix the penalty as life instead of sentencing her bunny to death. "Ted is a large part of my life, a vital part," she said, calling him warm, kind, and patient. "I've been associated with Ted in virtually every imaginable circumstance. He's been involved with my family. I've never seen anything in Ted that indicates any kind of destructiveness or hostility towards any other people," end quote. Then Ted stood up and directly examined Carole on the stand. "Carole, do you want to marry me?" "Yes," she responded. "And I want to marry you," Bundy stated. "Yes," Carole repeated. They'd taken advantage of a little-known Florida law, stating that a marriage declaration in open court before a judge constituted a legal marriage. Carole Boone was now Mrs. Ted Bundy. The jury, perhaps sensing that Bundy had tried to gain their sympathy in the last hour, was not swayed. After deliberating for only 45 minutes, they recommended a sentence of death for the groom. Bundy was still being investigated for the murders and disappearances of women in the Pacific Northwest, Idaho, Utah, and Colorado. Meanwhile, Carole was attempting to get pregnant. Ted was housed in a secure unit on Florida State Prison's death row, but apparently it wasn't very secure. Carole was allowed to spend time with Ted in the visitor's room, and they had sex several times. Conjugal visits were strictly prohibited for inmates, but it's been said that guards could be bribed to look away to give couples a few minutes of privacy. In February 1981, a year after Bundy was sentenced to death for a third time, Carole became pregnant. The baby was conceived behind a water cooler. Carole laughed about the sexual rendezvous with her husband, saying that, quote, "After the first day, the guards just don't care. They even walked in on us a couple of times." On October 24, 1981, Ted Bundy's first and only biological child, Rosa, was born. Bundy gushed about his wife and child in a letter to a friend the following evening. Quote, "I'm a papa. Lord, I'm in a daze. I still don't believe it. It's like the Christmas of Christmas. It's a lovely dream that's become real. Rosa is so perfectly beautiful. Carole is wonderful beyond words. In fact, my joy that Carole made it through the birth is equal to that which I feel towards our new child." He then writes about waiting in suspense after hearing Carole had gone into labor. Quote, "I had no way of knowing what was happening. Visiting hours were just about over Sunday, and I had just about given up hope when I received word I had a visit. You can't imagine what a thrill it was to see Carole, the baby, most of all the baby. But there was my dear, dear wife, less than 24 hours after birth, visiting me. Carole is the greatest," end quote. Carole was hired at the University of Florida at Gainesville, about an hour's drive from the prison. Her son Jamie was enrolled in the local high school and joined the football team. Carole and Jamie became vocal advocates against the death penalty. They attended protests, marches, and meetings and gave interviews. Carole continued to assert that Ted was innocent and had been unfairly tried in the media. Bundy's post-conviction defense attorney, Polly Nelson, managed to win him 3 stays of execution. The first stay was granted just hours before he was scheduled to be executed for the murder of Kimberly Leach. In her memoir, Defending the Devil, Nelson writes that Carole's life revolved around Ted's needs. She met Carole when her daughter Rosa was 4. Carole had taken Rosa to visit her father in prison every Saturday since she was born. Nelson writes, quote, "The effect of Rosa in Ted's life was to give him his first glimmer of heartfelt love. Until then, I think he had believed that no such emotion truly existed, and that the rest of us had been faking it too." Nelson attempted to stop the execution by arguing that Bundy had been mentally incompetent when he had acted as his own attorney during his trials. As she detailed her strategy to Carole, she noticed that Carole grew tense. Finally, Carole tersely responded, "Ted is not incompetent. I was there at the trial. He was anything but incompetent. There is nothing mentally wrong with him." Nelson was surprised at her reaction. She thought Carole would do anything to save Ted. Quote, "Apparently not. It seemed as though there was something more at stake here for Carole. Perhaps the image she had of Ted was even more important to keep alive than Ted himself." End quote. Carole's reaction may be best understood by a psychological concept known as cognitive dissonance, the discomfort of holding a belief that contradicts with reality. A person who experiences cognitive dissonance may mold the facts in their minds to fit their beliefs. Polly Nelson believed that Carole, quote, "needed Ted to be innocent because if he was not, the cause to which she had devoted over a decade of her life was meaningless, and she had been profoundly manipulated, played for a fool." Rather than experiencing the emotional pain of acknowledging any possibility of guilt, Carole decided that his innocence was infallible and everyone was out to get him. End quote. Carole once adamantly stated that she'd need irrefutable physical evidence of guilt before abandoning her trust in Ted. "Unless such a thing happens, or unless he tells me that he has killed," she said, "I stand on my rock." Carole Boone's rock would crumble just days before her husband's scheduled execution date in January 1989. As Bundy's appeals were being exhausted, and Carole was feeling the stress of parenting a teenager, a toddler, and being Ted's emotional caregiver, she began to crack under the strain. In August 1986, her mother was injured in an accident in Seattle, and Carole went home to care for her. Carole's relationship with Ted was already changing. According to a close friend, Carole found him obsessive, demanding, and needing her constant attention. Carole may have used the unfortunate accident to distance herself from Ted for good. She brought Rosa to see her father just one more time in May of 1987. Carole visited him for the last time on Thanksgiving 1987. She did not see her husband during the entire year before his execution. Jamie Boone, still living in the Florida area, did visit his stepfather periodically. Bundy was willing to do anything to buy more time as the execution date grew closer. Days before he was scheduled to pay the ultimate price for his crimes, Bundy considered cooperating with investigators who were still seeking answers. Calling it bones for time, Bundy would finally confess to several other murders he'd committed and disclose where he had hidden the bodies. Bundy wasn't necessarily interested in assisting in closing cases or even providing answers to grieving families. His motivation was purely self-serving. He was attempting to prolong his life and perhaps win points with authorities in an attempt to have his sentence commuted to life in prison. At this late date, Bundy no longer refused to admit guilt. He was terrified of being strapped to Old Sparky, Florida's electric chair, one of the most excruciating forms of capital punishment ever devised, perfectly appropriate for the likes of Theodore Robert Bundy, in my opinion. On January 19th, 5 days before the scheduled execution, Bundy called Carole in Seattle. He asked if she thought he should do a bones for time deal with investigators. Carole was confused. "How are you going to do a bones for time if you didn't do it?" she asked. The truth finally began to seep into her consciousness in the ensuing silence. Stunned and devastated, Carole hung up the phone. Bundy had requested to speak to his daughter one last time, but Carole refused and never spoke to him again. Over the next few days, Bundy confessed to Kings County homicide detective Robert Keppel that he was responsible for all 8 of the murders he was suspected of in Washington. He also admitted to 5 other murders, recounting each in detail. He did not know the identities of at least 2 of the female victims. In addition, Bundy spoke to detectives from Idaho, Utah, and Colorado, confessing to even more homicides, some of which were unknown to law enforcement in those states. One of Bundy's attorneys petitioned the governor of Florida to delay the execution to give Bundy more time to reveal additional information. The governor, with the support of the families of other victims, refused. Quote, "We are not going to have the system manipulated," Governor Bob Martinez told reporters. "For Bundy to be negotiating for his life over the bodies of victims is despicable." One day before the execution, Bundy sat for a video-recorded interview with evangelical Christian author, broadcaster, and psychologist Dr. James Dobson. Bundy admitted to the murders he was accused of, but blamed his actions on an addiction to alcohol and pornography. That evening, the U.S. Supreme Court rejected an emergency stay of execution. Bundy was executed on Tuesday morning, January 24, 1989. He requested that his ashes be scattered in Washington State's Cascade Mountains, saying it was a special place for him. Several of Bundy's victims' remains have never been found. It's believed that some of them were dumped in the Cascade Mountains. After Bundy's death, Carole Boone severed all ties with his family. According to Richard Bundy, she did not explain, and they never saw her or Ted's daughter Rosa again. Their attempts to contact her were unsuccessful, and they only learned through a third party that she did not wish to see them. Carole and Rosa changed their names and resided in Washington State for the next 30 years. The last known contact anyone associated with Ted Bundy had with Carole was in 1991. Dr. Dorothy Lewis, a prison psychiatrist who specializes in the study of violent criminals, had been one of Bundy's psychiatrists. Carole, perhaps in a final attempt to understand her late husband's actions and motivations, reached out to Dr. Lewis to give her a collection of letters Ted had written to her while he was on death row. After that interaction, Carole went back into hiding. In 2018, Carole Ann Boone died in a nursing home at the age of 70. She had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis and died from complications of the disease. Contrary to rumor, Carole did not divorce Ted Bundy and was still legally married to him upon his death. Ted Bundy's daughter Rosa has remained out of the public eye. She reportedly was given a new name while she was still a child and moved to a different state. When asked about Carole and Ted's relationship, Bundy's former girlfriend, Liz Kendall, aka Elizabeth Klopfer, said, quote, "I felt like she was going to be roped in just like I was. She was going to be used just like I was. This wasn't going to end well for her. Ted had spent a lifetime observing women and deciding who would become a victim. I think he could tell when women had a codependency issue, where they wanted to help him in any way they could." End quote. Carole's close friend Diana Smith, whom she'd met while protesting the death penalty, described her friend's motivations for her refusal to face the truth until the very end. In her opinion, Carole held tightly onto an unrealistic dream for her life in a desperate attempt to make amends for her brother's tragic death. Quote, "She and Ted were going to build a life together where she would get him off death row and they would have a family. She was going to save him, and that goes back to her history of her brother who drowned in their neighbor's pool. She definitely felt responsible and very guilty about Frank's drowning while she was supposed to be watching him. So that was one piece of the puzzle. I need to save. I need to redeem. I will save this man." End quote. Trish Woods, director of the Ted Bundy documentary series Falling for a Killer, says, quote, "I think Ted probably spotted a vulnerability in Carole Boone that he could exploit. She was a woman of great depth and intelligence, but seemed to be really irretrievably broken, which made her vulnerable to a guy like that." Stephen Michaud had his own theory of why Carole Boone dedicated her time and effort and sacrificed her life for a serial killer. Quote, "I don't know if Carole ever loved Ted in any kind of normal way," he said. "She had a hyper sense of right and wrong, a misplaced mothering instinct, and a very idealistic idea of what the criminal justice system should do. And she got disappointed and got lied to. But I don't know, even if I told her, I don't know that she ever would have really abandoned him. The break that she made with the world was really phenomenal. She was all alone out there, and all she got was kicked in the teeth for it." End quote. Michaud also sought to understand Bundy's appeal to women in general. He believed that his choice of volunteer work in the mid-1970s, where he first met Carole, was telling. Quote, "So many women were drawn to Ted. He really drew a lot of them in. He told me that during the time he worked at the suicide crisis hotline in Seattle, he had the best results from women, particularly young women. He was able to talk them out of their suicidal thoughts. And right there, I knew that Ted was a sociopath. He wasn't empathic with anybody. I think he really got off on the fact that he could manipulate them, because that was part of the thrill. If he could talk a girl out of killing herself, he could also talk her into being killed. Even if Bundy didn't actually kill her, Carole Boone's story certainly illustrates his ability to talk a woman into destroying her life for him, Michaud concluded. That will do it for this episode of Once Upon a Crime. I'll be back next week with another episode of the series, So I Married a Serial Killer. I hope you'll join me then. Don't forget to check out our videos on YouTube. Subscribe to enjoy documentary-style videos of true crime stories I've shared on Once Upon a Crime. Look for Once Upon a Crime podcast on YouTube, or click on the link in the show notes. I'll appear at the Beyond the Crime Convention in Albuquerque, New Mexico on March 15th. Get your tickets now for this all-day event that brings together true crime survivors, family members of the missing, detectives, advocates, true crime content creators, and their followers who advocate for the voiceless. Go to beyondcrimeconvention.com and use our promo code BEYOND-OUAC to score tickets, and I'll see you there. Once Upon a Crime is written and produced by me, Esther Sanchez Ludlow. My executive producer is Lorena Garcia. My researcher is Emma Battaglia. Until next time, be good to one another.